On a
Parole
cold
denied.
Tuesday morning in
Permanently.
downtown Chicago, the cramped courtroom buzzed with a tense energy that felt almost electric. Rows of wooden benches were filled with an anxious mix of legal professionals, family members, and a handful of curious onlookers, all waiting for the parole hearing to begin. At the center of this storm sat a young man, barely 17, whose presence seemed to command attention in a way that unsettled even the most seasoned spectators. His name was Marcus Rivera, a youth whose life had become a complicated tapestry of defiance, survival, and a reputation that preceded him. As the hearing commenced, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional clearing of throats. Marcus sat confidently in the defendant's chair, his posture relaxed but deliberate. What caught everyone's eye immediately was not his expression, but rather the vivid display of tattoos sprawling across his neck and arms, partially visible beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his prison-issued shirt. Each inked symbol seemed to tell a story. Dark, jagged lines intertwined with cryptic letters and numbers. To some, it was an impressive exhibition of personal art. To others, a glaring signal of rebellion. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. The presiding judge, a stern man in his 60s with decades of experience behind the bench, observed Marcus intently. His eyes narrowed slightly as Marcus shifted his sleeve deliberately, revealing more of the intricate designs that covered his forearm. The courtroom was keenly aware of this subtle act, a silent statement from the young man that transcended words. For Marcus, the tattoos were a badge of identity, a shield forged in the crucible of his environment. But for the judge, they represented something far more troubling. A visible refusal to shed the past that had landed Marcus in this very courtroom. The hearing began with routine formalities, but the atmosphere shifted palpably when Marcus, without prompt, slowly lifted his arm and turned it toward the assembled panel. The judge's voice faltered for just a moment as the young man's tattoos caught the light. A sprawling mural of gang insignias and cryptic symbols that many in the room instantly recognized. It was a calculated move, an unspoken challenge to the authority in the room. Marcus's lips curled into a faint smirk, a subtle indication that he was not here to plead for mercy. The parole board exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying a mix of surprise and concern. Some whispered quietly among themselves, trying to interpret the meaning behind Marcus's gesture. To the judge, however, the display was unmistakable, a sign that the young man had not only failed to distance himself from the gang affiliations that marked his tattoos, but was embracing them openly. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured but firm as he addressed Marcus. "Mr. Rivera," he began, "your decision to reveal these tattoos today is not lost on this court. It suggests to me a continuing allegiance to a lifestyle that has brought you here, and one that I believe you have not yet renounced." The words hung heavily in the air, underscoring the gravity of the situation. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the judge's interpretation settling over everyone like a thick fog. Marcus met the judge's gaze with a steady stare, unflinching and unapologetic. To him, the tattoos were more than mere ink. They were a testament to his survival, a narrative etched in flesh that told the story of a young man molded by the unforgiving streets. But in this setting, the tattoos took on a different meaning, a symbol of defiance, resistance to rehabilitation, and a potential roadblock to freedom. Outside the courtroom, whispers quickly spread among the observers, fueling debates about the role of personal expression in the criminal justice system. Some argued that tattoos were a form of self-identity and culture, a language that outsiders might not fully understand. Others contended that in Marcus's case, the tattoos were inseparable from his criminal past and posed a genuine concern for his future behavior. The parole board was caught in the middle of this complex dialogue, tasked with weighing the significance of what was visible on Marcus's skin against the intangible measures of remorse and reform. The hearing pressed on, but the moment had already set the tone. Marcus's tattoos were no longer just personal art. They had become evidence in the eyes of the law. The judge's scrutiny intensified. Every gesture and word from Marcus dissected for clues about his readiness to rejoin society. The young man's defiant posture seemed to reinforce the narrative that he was still entrenched in the world that had brought him here, a world defined by codes inked permanently onto his body. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a more complicated story, one of a teenager grappling with identity, loyalty, and the desire to be seen. Marcus's tattoos were born out of a need to claim ownership of a life that had often felt out of control. Each symbol was a chapter of his history, a way to communicate pain, power, and belonging in a place that had offered little stability. But in the sterile environment of the courtroom, these meanings were overshadowed by suspicion and fear. The judge's voice cut through these unspoken tensions as he addressed the parole board. We must consider whether Mr. Rivera's visible affiliations indicate a genuine risk to public safety. His tattoos speak volumes about his associations and mindset, and we cannot ignore what they represent. The statement underscored the challenge faced by the justice system, balancing the recognition of individual expression with the imperative to protect the community. Marcus's attorney rose to respond, attempting to shift the narrative. He argued that the tattoos should not be taken as sole indicators of character or future behavior. Instead, he painted a picture of a young man capable of change, someone who had taken steps toward rehabilitation despite the visible marks of his past. Psychological assessments and reports from counselors were submitted as evidence, suggesting that Marcus had potential for growth and reintegration. Despite these arguments, the judge remained unmoved by the display of ink. To him, the tattoos were more than skin deep. They were a symbol of unresolved allegiance to a dangerous lifestyle. The hearing would continue, but the impact of that moment lingered, shaping the way everyone in the courtroom perceived Marcus Rivera and the question of his parole. As the session adjourned for a brief recess, murmurs filled the room. The story unfolding before them was not just about a young man seeking freedom. It was about the larger struggle to interpret identity, defiance, and redemption through the lens of visible symbols. Marcus's tattoos had spoken loudly today, and their message had left an indelible mark on the course of his hearing. Marcus Rivera's tattoos had cast a long shadow over the parole hearing, but to understand why they elicited such a strong reaction, one had to look deeper into the young man's troubled past. His history was a stark mosaic of hardship, danger, and choices made under pressure. A story that unfolded long before the courtroom drama began. Born and raised in one of Chicago's most violent neighborhoods, Marcus's early years were marked by instability and scarcity, a backdrop that shaped the trajectory of his life in profound ways. Growing up in a cramped apartment on the city's south side, Marcus was the eldest of 3 siblings. His mother worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, but the absence of a father figure left a void that the streets quickly filled. The neighborhood was a battleground. Gangs controlled territory with ruthless efficiency, and violence was a daily reality. From a young age, Marcus learned that survival required toughness and allegiance. It was in this environment that his tattoos began to take form. each one etched as a symbol of belonging and protection. By the time Marcus reached his early teens, he had become deeply involved in local gang activity. His tattoos were not random. They were carefully chosen emblems that told the story of his affiliations and his status within the group. Among the ink were gang initials, numbers representing crew ties, and symbols that marked him as a loyal member, willing to defend his turf at any cost. These marks served both as armor and as a warning, signaling to others the identity he had forged in the crucible of the streets. Marcus's criminal record reflected the harsh realities of his upbringing. At just 14, he was first arrested for possession of a weapon, an incident that foreshadowed a pattern of escalating offenses. Over the next few years, his involvement in gang-related crimes deepened, including assaults, robberies, and a violent confrontation that ultimately landed him in juvenile detention. Each offense was a chapter in a narrative intertwined with survival, peer pressure, and the limited options available to a boy trying to navigate an unforgiving world. The parole board had before them a dossier that detailed these offenses, painting a picture of a youth shaped by circumstance and hardened by necessity. The reports emphasized Marcus's participation in gang disputes and his association with known criminals, underscoring the risks he posed not only to himself, but to the broader community. The tattoos that so visibly adorned his skin were inseparable from this narrative. They were a living record of his affiliations and a constant reminder of the life he led. But Marcus's story was not solely defined by crime. Interspersed within the legal documents were accounts from social workers and counselors who had worked with him during his incarceration. They spoke of a boy who, despite his tough exterior, exhibited moments of vulnerability and a desire to escape the cycle of violence. Programs aimed at education and therapy had been introduced to Marcus, and there were reports of his participation in conflict resolution workshops and vocational training. These efforts suggested that beneath the gang symbols was a young man wrestling with his identity and seeking a path forward. Yet, the weight of Marcus's past was inescapable. The crimes that brought him to jail were recent and serious, leaving no easy answers for those tasked with deciding his fate. His tattoos, many of which were linked directly to his gang involvement, were seen by the parole board as more than mere decoration. They were markers of a life still deeply enmeshed in a dangerous subculture. The visibility of these tattoos during the hearing only reinforced the perception that Marcus remained loyal to a lifestyle that had caused so much harm. Within the courtroom, a palpable tension lingered between the opposing narratives. On one hand was the young man's background, a story of neglect, hardship, and the influence of environment. On the other was the undeniable reality of his actions and the symbols that declared his continued allegiance. The parole board was faced with the difficult task of balancing empathy for Marcus's circumstances against the imperative to ensure public safety. Marcus's defense attorney sought to humanize the young man, presenting a portrait of someone whose criminal behavior was a product of systemic failures rather than inherent malice. The attorney highlighted Marcus's efforts to engage with rehabilitative programs and argued that his tattoos reflected a complex identity rather than a simple criminal allegiance. They urged the board to consider the potential for change, emphasizing that Marcus was still a teenager, capable of growth and transformation despite the marks on his skin. Meanwhile, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture. They underscored the severity of Marcus's crimes and the danger he posed if released prematurely. The tattoos, in their view, were not symbols of culture or art, but badges of ongoing criminal involvement. They argued that Marcus's visible affiliations were a clear signal that he had not distanced himself from his gang ties and that releasing him would jeopardize community safety. The prosecution called upon victim testimonies and community leaders who spoke of fear and trauma caused by gang violence, reinforcing the urgency of a cautious approach. The complexity of Marcus's background challenged the parole board to look beyond surface appearances, yet also demanded that they heed the realities those appearances represented. His tattoos, while personal and meaningful to him, were inseparable from a life marked by gang activity and violence. The board grappled with the question of whether Marcus could truly abandon the past his body bore witness to, or whether those symbols were a sign that he remained bound to it. As the hearing progressed, the layers of Marcus's story unfolded with increasing clarity. His involvement in gang conflicts was not isolated. It was part of a broader narrative of community struggle, systemic neglect, and the cyclical nature of violence that ensnared many youths like him. His tattoos were a map of that journey, each emblem a waypoint in a life shaped by forces often beyond his control. Yet, amid the legal arguments and psychological reports, there was an undeniable human element. Marcus was a boy caught between worlds, trying to assert his identity while facing the consequences of his choices. His tattoos were both a shield and a scar, symbols of belonging and markers of exclusion. They told a story that was as much about survival as it was about defiance. A story that the parole board had to reckon with as they weighed the possibility of his release. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now held a quiet anticipation as the hearing moved forward. Marcus's background had been laid bare, not just as a litany of offenses, but as a complex mosaic of environment, identity, and struggle. His tattoos were no longer just ink on skin. They were the visible threads that connected his past to his present, shaping the difficult decisions that lay ahead. The parole hearing entered its most contentious phase, as Marcus Rivera, the 17-year-old defendant, took a deliberate and calculated step that would shift the courtroom's atmosphere from tense to charged. As the board members reviewed his file and heard arguments from both sides, Marcus seized a moment to assert himself in a way few expected. Slowly, almost theatrically, he rolled up the sleeves of his prison uniform, revealing the sprawling tattoos that covered his forearms and wrists. The courtroom, once quiet and composed, rippled with murmurs and sideways glances. Marcus's actions were not accidental or impulsive. They were a purposeful display, a silent yet potent message directed at the judge, the parole board, and everyone present. His tattoos, a vivid tapestry of gang symbols, cryptic numbers, and bold lettering, were more than mere ink. They embodied his identity and his past, a past he apparently wore with pride rather than shame. His gaze remained steady, unyielding, and unapologetic, as if daring the court to make sense of the story etched onto his skin. The parole board members exchanged uneasy looks as Marcus's forearms came fully into view. The symbols were unmistakable to anyone familiar with Chicago's gang culture. The intertwined letters of a notorious street gang, the numbers indicating territorial claims, and other imagery that spoke to a life entrenched in violence and defiance. This bold exhibition disrupted the usual decorum of the hearing, introducing an element of confrontation that unsettled many in the room. Several spectators shifted in their seats, some whispering about the audacity of the display, others quietly questioning whether this was a sign of raw honesty or brazen defiance. The judge's expression hardened as he regarded Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly with a mixture of disappointment and suspicion. For the judge, the tattoos were not simply personal statements. They were visual evidence of an ongoing allegiance to a lifestyle that had landed Marcus behind bars in the first place. The courtroom's dynamic changed instantly. What had been a procedural hearing transformed into a subtle but palpable battle of wills. Marcus's decision to reveal his tattoos in such a deliberate fashion was interpreted by many as a challenge to the authority of the court. It was as if he was asserting control in a setting designed to strip him of it, reaffirming his identity in the face of judgment. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Rivera," he began, his tone sharp but controlled. "These tattoos you have chosen to display here today are not insignificant. They represent something far more than art or personal expression." His gaze swept the room, then returned to the young man before him. "They tell a story of ongoing allegiance to a criminal lifestyle. I must question whether you have truly distanced yourself from that past, or if you continue to embrace it." Marcus met the judge's challenge head-on. His posture remained steady, and his eyes locked with the judge's in a silent exchange that spoke volumes. To Marcus, the tattoos were a form of self-expression, a testament to the life he had lived and the identity he had forged. To the court, they were a symbol of resistance and an obstacle to rehabilitation. The parole board members, tasked with the weighty responsibility of deciding Marcus's fate, found themselves grappling with the meaning behind the tattoos. Were they a sign of a young man still entangled in gang culture, or simply an expression of his personal history and pain? The courtroom's atmosphere thickened with this unspoken question as the hearing continued. The defense attorney quickly moved to mitigate the impact of Marcus's display. Standing, she addressed the court with measured calm. "Your Honor, the tattoos Mr. Rivera bears are indeed significant to him. But they should not be viewed solely through the lens of criminality," she argued. Tattoos can be a form of personal identity, a way for individuals, especially young people, to make sense of their experiences. We ask the court to consider that these marks do not necessarily equate to ongoing criminal behavior or a refusal to reform. She presented psychological evaluations that described Marcus as a young man wrestling with his identity, someone who had shown moments of introspection despite his past. Counselors working with him noted his participation in educational and therapeutic programs, highlighting his potential for rehabilitation. "The tattoos are part of his story," she continued, "but they should not be weaponized as proof of a lack of remorse or growth." Despite these assertions, the prosecution took a firm stance. The lead prosecutor rose, her voice steady but forceful. "These tattoos are not mere decorations," she stated, "but clear symbols of gang affiliation and ongoing defiance. They are a visual testament to a lifestyle that has caused harm to our community. Mr. Rivera's choice to display them here is a deliberate act, signaling that he has not renounced his past." She called upon statements from victims' families and community representatives who spoke of the fear and trauma wrought by gang violence. "When someone like Mr. Rivera parades these symbols before the court," she argued, "it sends a message to the community that he remains a threat. Our responsibility is to protect the public and ensure that those who pose a danger are not released prematurely." The courtroom was awash with tension, the competing narratives clashing with palpable force. Marcus's tattoos had become more than skin deep. They were a battleground where identity, defiance, and the hope for redemption collided. The parole board members listened intently, their faces revealing the difficult balancing act they faced. Historical context provided a backdrop to this confrontation. Tattoos had long been associated with gang culture and criminality, particularly in urban settings like Chicago. Law enforcement agencies often used visible tattoos as markers to identify gang members and assess potential risks. This cultural association meant that the tattoos Marcus bore carried an additional weight beyond personal meaning. They were intertwined with the social realities of violence and criminal networks, Yet, societal attitudes toward tattoos were also evolving. Tattoos had become mainstream expressions of art, identity, and culture across diverse populations. This broader acceptance complicated the interpretation of Marcus's ink, challenging the parole board to discern whether it was appropriate to view his tattoos solely as signs of criminal defiance or as a more nuanced form of self-expression. As the hearing progressed, the judge returned to the forefront, his decision looming over the room. "The display of these tattoos here today," he declared, "cannot be separated from the context of Mr. Rivera's past and the ongoing risk he may pose. It is my duty to consider whether this young man has truly embraced change or remains bound by a dangerous allegiance." Marcus's calm defiance in revealing his tattoos had shifted the focus of the hearing, forcing all present to confront the complex interplay between identity, appearance, and the possibility of reform. The courtroom buzzed with silent speculation as the parole board prepared to deliberate, their minds weighed down by the significance of what had been shown, not just in words, but in ink. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread quickly. Community members, legal experts, and advocates debated the implications of Marcus's tattoo display. Was it a cry for recognition, a symbol of pride, or a troubling sign of unresolved loyalty to a life of crime? The question lingered, reflecting a broader societal struggle to interpret the language of tattoos within the justice system. For Marcus Rivera, the moment was both a challenge and a statement. His tattoos, once hidden beneath sleeves and silence, had been revealed in full view of those who held his fate in their hands. Whether they would be seen as a barrier to freedom or a part of a complex personal narrative remained to be decided. But one thing was clear. Marcus had chosen to speak through his body, and the court had no choice but to listen. The judge's gaze lingered on Marcus Rivera's inked forearms, the vivid symbols casting shadows across the courtroom as if they bore silent witness to the young man's past, and perhaps his future. After hours of testimony, arguments, and the silent display of defiance through tattoos, the judge was now tasked with distilling these complex signals into a clear judicial response. His reaction to Marcus's tattoo display would shape not only the outcome of the parole hearing, but also send ripples through the community and the justice system at large. Leaning forward, his voice calm but resolute, the judge addressed the courtroom. "Mr. Rivera," he began, "the tattoos you have chosen to reveal to this court today are not mere marks on your skin. They are, in my view, emblematic of ongoing affiliations and allegiances that have contributed to your incarceration." The courtroom fell silent, every word carrying weight. These symbols suggest that you have not fully distanced yourself from the lifestyle that led to your offenses. The judge's interpretation was rooted in a broader concern, that visible tattoos, especially those linked to gang culture, often indicate a persistent identity bound up with criminal activity. To him, Marcus's tattoos were more than personal expression. They were signs of defiance and unresolved loyalty. Such a stance framed the tattoos as obstacles to rehabilitation rather than milestones of growth. He continued, "The court must consider whether these tattoos, and the attitudes they represent, reflect a genuine commitment to change or a refusal to disengage from past behaviors." His eyes swept across the parole board members, reinforcing the gravity of the decision that lay ahead. "In the absence of clear evidence to the contrary, I must view these displays as a cause for concern regarding your readiness to reintegrate safely into society." This judicial reasoning underscored the tension between personal identity and perceived risk. The tattoos, by their very visibility, challenged the court's ability to assess Marcus's character solely on traditional measures of remorse and rehabilitation. Instead, they became visual testimony, shaping the narrative in powerful, often prejudicial ways. The judge's perspective was not formed in isolation. It reflected a long-standing judicial and law enforcement view that tattoos, particularly those associated with gangs, serve as markers of ongoing criminal affiliation. This context meant that Marcus's tattoos were not simply personal choices, but carried legal and social consequences far beyond their ink and design. His ruling was clear. The tattoos indicated that Marcus had not yet severed ties with the criminal lifestyle that led to his incarceration. This conclusion framed the parole board's deliberations, emphasizing caution and public safety over leniency. The judge's assessment suggested that the visible symbols of Marcus's past were intertwined with his present mindset and potential future actions. The courtroom responded to the judge's reasoning with a mixture of approval and unease. Some observers nodded in agreement, perceiving the tattoos as undeniable evidence of Marcus's continued defiance. Others exchanged worried glances, aware that such interpretations risked oversimplifying complex identities and could impede genuine rehabilitation efforts. The defense attorney rose once more to challenge the judge's interpretation. "Your Honor," she said, "while we acknowledge the significance of these tattoos to Mr. Rivera's identity, we urge the court to consider them within the broader context of his personal growth and the efforts he has made toward rehabilitation." She pointed to psychological evaluations and reports from counseling sessions that highlighted Marcus's participation in programs aimed at conflict resolution and self-improvement. These tattoos, she argued, are part of his history, but should not be conflated with a refusal to change. To do so risks reducing a young man to a set of symbols rather than recognizing his capacity for transformation. Her plea underscored the tension between judging a person by appearances and acknowledging the possibility of inner change. In response, the judge acknowledged the defense's points, but maintained his stance. The court is sympathetic to the challenges faced by young offenders. However, the display of these tattoos today has reinforced concerns that Mr. Rivera continues to identify with a criminal subculture. He emphasized that parole decisions must weigh public safety heavily, particularly when signs of defiance are so overt. The prosecution echoed the judge's concerns, highlighting the risk to the community if Marcus were released without clear evidence of renunciation. Victims' families submitted statements describing the lasting impact of gang violence, and community leaders spoke of the need for vigilance in cases like this. The tattoos, they argued, were a visible reminder of the danger Marcus represented. Throughout the hearing, experts in juvenile psychology and criminal behavior testified about the complex role tattoos play in identity formation. They explained that for many youths, tattoos symbolize belonging and protection in hostile environments, but can also serve as barriers to reintegration. This duality complicated the parole board's task, forcing them to balance empathy with caution. The judge's interpretation of Marcus's tattoos thus became a focal point, a visual shorthand that influenced perceptions of character, risk, and readiness for release. The ink on Marcus's skin was no longer just a personal narrative. It had become a legal symbol, interpreted as a defiant statement against rehabilitation. As the hearing continued, the judge's reasoning shaped the tone and direction of the proceedings. His view that the tattoos represented ongoing allegiance to a criminal lifestyle gave weight to the argument that Marcus was not yet prepared for parole. This perspective framed the decision as a necessary measure to protect the community, even as it raised questions about fairness and the complexities of youth identity. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with the understanding that Marcus's tattoos were not just marks, but markers, signposts in the legal and social evaluation of his future. The judge's words echoed beyond the room, touching on broader debates about how visible symbols influence justice and the path toward rehabilitation. In this critical moment, the judge's interpretation underscored the challenges inherent in balancing individual expression with public safety. Marcus Rivera's tattoos had become more than personal art. They were a lens through which his readiness for freedom was scrutinized, a symbol of defiance that the court found difficult to overlook. The weight of this interpretation would soon play a decisive role in determining whether he would be granted parole or remain confined. A young man still defined by the ink on his skin and the past it represented. The courtroom's atmosphere remained thick with tension as the defense attorney rose to counter the judge's interpretation of Marcus Rivera's tattoos. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a carefully constructed argument that sought to reframe the narrative from one of defiance to one of self-expression and potential rehabilitation. In the hushed chamber, she painted a picture of a young man not defined solely by ink on his skin, but by the complexity of his experiences and the possibility of change. "Your Honor," she began, "tattoos have long been a means of personal expression, a way for individuals, especially young people, to navigate identity and make sense of their pasts. Mr. Rivera's tattoos are indeed significant, but they should not be misinterpreted as fixed indicators of his character or future behavior." Her words sought to challenge the implicit assumptions linking visible tattoos directly to ongoing criminality. She leaned forward slightly, emphasizing the importance of context. These markings represent chapters of his life, yes, but they are also part of a broader journey, one that includes efforts at rehabilitation, self-reflection, and growth. The defense presented psychological evaluations conducted by experts who had worked closely with Marcus during his incarceration. These reports described a young man grappling with his past and striving to build a different future. According to the evaluations, Marcus exhibited signs of remorse and a willingness to engage with rehabilitative programs. Counselors noted his participation in conflict resolution workshops and vocational training, highlighting moments when he demonstrated insight into the consequences of his actions. These assessments painted a nuanced portrait of a youth caught between his past and the possibility of transformation. The defense attorney argued that the tattoos should be understood within this context, not as static symbols of defiance, but as part of a dynamic process of identity formation. To judge Mr. Rivera solely by the ink on his skin is to overlook the complexity of his experiences and the potential he holds for change, she urged. We ask the court to consider these factors when evaluating his suitability for parole. Her appeal struck at a fundamental tension within the justice system. The challenge of discerning the true character of a young offender amidst visible markers that carry heavy cultural and legal baggage. Tattoos, while often stigmatized in criminal contexts, also serve as a form of communication and self-definition, especially for youths navigating fractured social environments. The defense's argument resonated with a growing body of research that questioned the automatic association between tattoos and criminality. Sociologists and psychologists have noted that tattoos can signify resilience, personal history, and cultural identity. For many young people like Marcus, tattoos are a way to reclaim agency in environments where control is scarce. Yet, the defense's position faced significant hurdles. The parole board and the prosecution remained wary, viewing the tattoos through a lens shaped by public safety concerns and community impact. The visible symbols were difficult to disentangle from the offenses that had brought Marcus to the courtroom, and skepticism lingered about the sincerity of his rehabilitation efforts. The defense attorney anticipated these objections and addressed them head-on. "We acknowledge the seriousness of Mr. Rivera's past actions," she conceded. "But rehabilitation is a process, not an event. Visible symbols of identity, such as tattoos, should not be wielded as definitive evidence against that process." She urged the board to weigh psychological insights alongside the external markers, advocating for a more holistic understanding of Marcus's potential. As she spoke, the courtroom listened intently. The tension between appearance and substance laid bare. The defense's plea highlighted a deeper debate within the justice system: how to balance the need for security with the imperative to recognize individual growth, especially among young offenders whose identities are still in flux. The prosecution, however, remained steadfast in their position. They argued that Marcus's tattoos were inseparable from his past criminal affiliations and that their prominence in court signaled a lack of remorse and distance from gang culture. The prosecution emphasized the testimony of victims and community members who had suffered the consequences of gang-related violence, underscoring the stakes involved in the parole decision. Community advocates echoed these concerns, pointing to the broader impact of gang activity and the need for vigilance in cases involving visible symbols of criminal ties. They argued that granting parole to someone who openly displays such tattoos could undermine public trust in the justice system and jeopardize community safety. The parole board members found themselves navigating this complex terrain, weighing psychological assessments against public sentiment and the tangible symbols Marcus presented. They grappled with questions about how much weight to assign to visible tattoos when assessing a young man's readiness for release. Experts called to testify during the hearing offered insights into the psychological dimensions of tattoo symbolism. They explained that for many youths, tattoos are more than mere decoration. They are coping mechanisms, markers of belonging, and sometimes pathways to self-expression in communities where other forms of identity validation are scarce. This perspective challenged simplistic interpretations of tattoos as purely negative or threatening. These psychological insights complicated the board's deliberations. They underscored the need for a nuanced approach that recognized the multifaceted role tattoos play in the lives of young offenders. The board was reminded that while tattoos might signal past affiliations, they do not necessarily predict future behavior or negate the possibility of rehabilitation. The defense attorney's arguments and expert testimony collectively emphasized the importance of seeing beyond the surface. They called for a parole decision informed by a comprehensive view of Marcus's character and potential, rather than a judgment based solely on visible symbols. As the hearing drew on, the tension between the defense's call for compassion and the prosecution's demand for caution remained unresolved. Marcus Rivera's tattoos, bold, unmistakable, and laden with meaning, had become a focal point in a larger conversation about identity, justice, and the possibility of change. The courtroom, once filled with hushed whispers, now bore witness to a fundamental challenge in juvenile justice: reconciling the visible markers of a troubled past with the intangible hope for a different future. Marcus's tattoos, once a source of defiance, had also become a catalyst for reflection on the delicate balance between personal expression and societal expectations. In this charged atmosphere, the defense's plea for understanding echoed with urgency. They urged the court to recognize that beneath the ink was a young man still in formation, capable of growth and deserving of a chance to redefine himself beyond the images etched on his skin. The parole board's decision would hinge on whether they could embrace this complexity or remain bound by the stark symbolism of Marcus's tattoos. The prosecution rose with a measured but unwavering resolve, determined to counter the defense's narrative and reinforce the portrait of Marcus Rivera as a continuing threat to public safety. Their argument pivoted sharply from the personal and psychological framing offered by the defense to a hard-edged focus on community impact and the tangible consequences of Marcus's past actions. The courtroom filled with a somber weight as the lead prosecutor laid bare the stakes involved in the parole decision. "Members of the board," she began, her voice steady yet imbued with urgency. "Mr. Rivera's tattoos are not merely symbols of personal history or self-expression. They are markers of ongoing allegiance to a criminal lifestyle that has inflicted real harm on our community." Her words echoed through the courtroom, resonating with the families of victims seated among the observers. She proceeded to link specific tattoos to gang affiliations known for violent behavior and territorial control. "These tattoos are coded messages," she explained, "identifying Mr. Rivera as a member of a gang responsible for shootings, assaults, and intimidation within our neighborhoods. They serve as a warning and a reminder that he remains tied to these dangerous networks." The prosecution called upon the voices of victims' families, whose testimonies added a poignant and painful dimension to the hearing. A woman, her voice trembling but resolute, recounted the night her son was caught in a crossfire linked to gang violence. "We live in fear every day," she said. "Knowing someone like Marcus is out there, showing off these tattoos, it's like the pain never ends." Her words underscored the human cost behind the abstract legal arguments. Community representatives also took the stand, voicing concerns shared by many residents living in neighborhoods scarred by gang activity. They spoke of pervasive fear, disrupted lives, and the urgent need for accountability. "When someone displays these tattoos openly," one community leader said, "it sends a message that the old ways still hold power. It undermines the progress we fought so hard to achieve." The prosecution emphasized that Marcus's choice to reveal his tattoos during the hearing was not a harmless act of self-expression, but a deliberate signal of defiance. "This display," the prosecutor asserted, "demonstrates a lack of remorse and an unwillingness to separate from the affiliations that led to his incarceration. It raises serious concerns about whether he has truly committed to rehabilitation." Throughout the hearing, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with the weight of these testimonies. The stark contrast between the defense's portrayal of a young man seeking redemption and the prosecution's depiction of a persistent threat highlighted the challenge facing the parole board. The visible tattoos had become a focal point in this clash, a potent symbol that carried deep implications for the community's sense of safety. Experts in criminology and community dynamics were called to provide context for the prosecution's claims. They explained how tattoos function within gang culture as identifiers, symbols of loyalty, and deterrents to rivals. These markings often signify membership in groups involved in criminal enterprises and can influence behavior long after incarceration. The experts also highlighted the difficulties faced by parole boards when visible signs of gang affiliation persist. They noted that such tattoos complicate assessments of risk and rehabilitation, as they may reflect ongoing connections and attitudes difficult to change. This expert testimony lent weight to the prosecution's argument that Marcus's tattoos were more than personal history. They were indicators of potential recidivism. The prosecution's case resonated strongly with the parole board members, many of whom were acutely aware of the community's fears and the impact of gang violence. The visible tattoos, in this light, were not abstract symbols, but lived realities affecting countless families. The board faced the delicate task of balancing hope for Marcus's rehabilitation against the imperative to protect the public. In the courtroom, Marcus remained composed but visibly affected by the testimonies. The weight of the community's pain, conveyed through the voices of victims and leaders, underscored the consequences of his past and the stakes of his future. His tattoos, once a personal statement, had become entangled with the voices of those who had suffered from the violence they represented. Outside the courtroom, the case sparked discussion among residents and advocates. Some argued that the prosecution's emphasis on tattoos risked perpetuating stereotypes and stigmatizing youth in marginalized communities. Others contended that acknowledging the realities of gang affiliation and its symbols was necessary for effective justice and public safety. The prosecution's focus on the community impact of Marcus's tattoos brought into sharp relief the broader societal challenges at play. The visible ink was a symbol not only of individual identity, but of collective trauma, fear, and the ongoing struggle to break cycles of violence. The parole board's decision would have to reckon with these complex layers. As the hearing progressed, the prosecution made clear that their priority was safeguarding the community from potential harm. They urged the board to consider whether Marcus's tattoos and the affiliations they represented indicated a risk too great to permit early release. The call was for vigilance, caution, and a recognition that public safety must remain paramount. This perspective underscored a fundamental tension in the justice system. Balancing the rights and potential for rehabilitation of individuals like Marcus with the protection of communities ravaged by gang violence. The tattoos, as visible and unyielding markers, crystallized this tension in the hearts and minds of all present. The parole board members listened intently, aware that their decision extended beyond the courtroom walls. The visible tattoos had become a symbol of unresolved conflict between personal identity and societal security, between the desire for redemption and the imperative of safety. In this charged environment, the prosecution's arguments highlighted the stakes involved. Marcus Rivera's tattoos were not just ink. They were emblems of a past that had inflicted pain and fear on many. The question before the board was whether those symbols were a barrier too great to overcome, or a chapter in a story still open to change. The courtroom, heavy with emotion and conflicting narratives, awaited the next phase of the hearing. The prosecution's emphasis on community impact had shifted the focus from individual expression to collective consequence, deepening the complexity of the parole decision and underscoring the profound challenges faced by young offenders seeking a second chance. The courtroom's charged atmosphere was not only shaped by the immediate testimonies and arguments, but also by the deeper historical context that framed the significance of Marcus Rivera's tattoos. As the hearing progressed, the parole board and all present were reminded that the story of tattoos in the criminal justice system was far from new. It was embedded in decades of social, cultural, and legal narratives that shaped perceptions and prejudices surrounding inked bodies. Tattoos have historically occupied a complex space in society, seen alternately as art, rebellion, identity, or deviance. Within the criminal justice system, however, tattoos often carried an additional, more ominous meaning. For many years, law enforcement agencies and courts associated certain tattoos with gang membership, criminal histories, and recidivism. This association was particularly pronounced in urban centers like Chicago, where gang-related violence was a persistent challenge. During the hearing, an expert in criminal sociology was called to provide this essential backdrop. The expert explained how, over the decades, tattoos became a form of coded communication among gang members, a visual language that conveyed allegiance, rank, and territorial claims. In many communities, the expert testified, tattoos serve as markers of identity within groups that operate outside the law, creating bonds of loyalty and fear that extend beyond the individual. This historical lens helped clarify why Marcus's tattoos carried such heavy weight in the court's eyes. They were not merely personal expressions, but part of a larger cultural framework that law enforcement and judicial bodies relied upon to assess risk and character. The expert emphasized that these perceptions, while rooted in reality, also contributed to systemic biases that complicated fair assessments of individuals bearing such tattoos. The expert's testimony delved into how these associations influenced policing strategies and sentencing decisions. Visible tattoos often lead to heightened scrutiny, sometimes bias, and assumptions about criminality that may not always hold true, the expert noted. However, in many cases, these tattoos do correlate with gang involvement, making them a significant factor in evaluating potential threats. This nuanced view underscored the dual nature of tattoos within the justice system, as both cultural artifacts and legal signifiers. For Marcus Rivera, whose tattoos were undeniably linked to known gang symbols, this history meant that his ink was interpreted through a lens shaped by decades of law enforcement practice and societal perceptions. The parole board members listened intently, recognizing that their judgment was positioned at the intersection of personal identity and institutional history. The tattoos were not just individual choices, but emblematic of broader social dynamics that influenced the legal process. This understanding framed their deliberations with a deeper awareness of the challenges inherent in interpreting such visible markers. The expert also addressed the evolving conversation around tattoos in society at large. Tattoos, once marginalized or stigmatized, had gained mainstream acceptance as legitimate forms of self-expression. This cultural shift complicated the criminal justice system's traditional approach, prompting calls for more nuanced considerations in cases involving tattooed individuals. Despite this cultural evolution, the expert cautioned that the criminal justice system's historical associations with tattoos continued to exert a strong influence. The challenge lies in distinguishing between tattoos as art or identity and tattoos as symbols of ongoing criminal behavior, the expert explained. This distinction is critical, but often difficult to make, especially in cases involving gang-affiliated markings. This perspective illuminated the paradox facing the parole board: the need to balance evolving societal attitudes with the practical realities of gang violence and public safety. Marcus Rivera's tattoos sat squarely at this crossroads, embodying both personal history and the institutional fears that shaped his case. The historical context also shed light on the judge's earlier reactions to Marcus's tattoo display. The judge's interpretation was informed not only by the immediate facts, but by a legal culture steeped in decades of associating tattoos with risk and defiance. This cultural framework influenced the court's perception of Marcus's readiness for parole and colored the narrative of his identity. As the hearing unfolded, this broader understanding of tattoos enriched the dialogue among legal professionals, advocates, and community members. It prompted reflection on how deeply ingrained biases and historical associations could affect judgments, sometimes overshadowing the individual's potential for change. In this light, Marcus's tattoos were more than mere symbols on skin. They were touchstones in a long history of societal and institutional responses to visible markers of identity. The parole board was called to navigate this complex terrain, weighing the significance of these tattoos against the backdrop of evolving cultural meanings and entrenched legal practices. The courtroom, heavy with the weight of history and the immediacy of Marcus's fate, became a microcosm of a larger societal debate. How should the justice system interpret tattoos that carry both cultural significance and associations with criminality? To what extent should visible markers influence decisions about rehabilitation and release? These questions lingered as the expert concluded, leaving the parole board with a deeper appreciation of the multifaceted nature of tattoos within the justice system. The hearing was no longer solely about Marcus Rivera as an individual, but about the broader implications of how identity, appearance, and history intersect in the pursuit of justice. The expert's testimony did not resolve these tensions, but illuminated the challenges and complexities that framed Marcus's case. The parole board faced the daunting task of applying this historical and cultural knowledge to a decision that balanced personal potential against public safety concerns. As the hearing moved toward its next phase, the courtroom remained charged with the awareness that Marcus's tattoos were emblematic of a broader societal struggle. They were symbols that carried the weight of history, culture, and legal precedent, an indelible part of the story unfolding before the court. In this crucible of judgment, Marcus Rivera's future hinged not only on his actions and character, but on the deep and often fraught meanings inscribed upon his skin. Meanings shaped by decades of social context and legal interpretation. The parole board's deliberations would have to navigate these layers with care and understanding, aware that their decision would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The day's proceedings drew to a close as the judge prepared to deliver the parole board's ruling, a moment charged with anticipation, solemnity, and the weight of years of legal precedent and personal testimony. The courtroom, packed with observers ranging from family members to community leaders, fell into a heavy silence. Each person acutely aware that this decision would reverberate far beyond the walls of the building. At its center was Marcus Rivera, the young man whose tattoos had become both a symbol and a battleground for the question of his future. The judge's demeanor was firm, his voice measured and deliberate as he addressed the room. After careful consideration of the evidence, testimonies, and psychological evaluations presented during this hearing, the board has reached a decision regarding Mr. Rivera's suitability for parole. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a dense fog, thick with unresolved tension. He continued, "The court acknowledges the efforts Mr. Rivera has made toward rehabilitation and the complexities inherent in his background." There was a brief pause, allowing the recognition of these efforts to resonate. However, the judge added, the visible tattoos displayed during the hearing, many of which are known symbols of gang affiliation, indicate to the court an ongoing connection to a lifestyle that poses a significant risk to public safety. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge's reasoning unfolded. To him, the tattoos were not mere personal expressions, but signals of continued allegiance to a criminal subculture. The display of these tattoos in such a calculated manner during the hearing suggests a lack of remorse and an unwillingness to fully disassociate from past behaviors, he asserted. This, coupled with the nature of Mr. Rivera's offenses and the testimonies of community members impacted by gang violence, informs the board's decision. With solemnity, the judge announced that Marcus Rivera's parole request was denied indefinitely. The ruling was firm, unequivocal, and underscored by a zero-tolerance approach to signs of defiance within the courtroom. It is the court's responsibility to prioritize the safety and well-being of the community, he concluded. Until there is clear evidence of genuine renunciation of these affiliations, parole cannot be granted. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and palpable. A mixture of shock, disappointment, and subdued murmurs rippled through the audience. Some observers nodded in understanding, given the gravity of the crimes and the symbolic weight of the tattoos. Others exchanged glances filled with uncertainty and concern over the implications of the ruling. Marcus himself remained composed, though a flicker of frustration crossed his features. His calm demeanor masked the internal turmoil of a young man grappling with the harsh finality of the decision. To him, the tattoos had been a form of identity and survival, not a barrier to his future. Now, they had become a symbol of exclusion, a visible mark that overshadowed other aspects of his character and efforts. The parole board's ruling sparked immediate debate among legal professionals and advocates present. Some praised the decision as necessary for maintaining public safety and upholding justice for victims. They argued that visible signs of gang affiliation could not be ignored, and that premature release could endanger vulnerable communities. Conversely, others voiced concern that the ruling might perpetuate stigmatization of youth with tattoos, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds. They warned that denying parole based on visible symbols risked reinforcing cycles of exclusion and failed to acknowledge the potential for rehabilitation. This discourse reflected ongoing tensions within the juvenile justice system about balancing accountability and compassion. The judge's decision was also noted for its broader implications. It sent a clear message about the weight given to external symbols, tattoos, as indicators of character and risk. This stance underscored a judicial philosophy that placed significant emphasis on visible signs of defiance, sometimes over more nuanced assessments of personal growth. In the days following the hearing, community leaders and criminal justice reform advocates engaged in public discussions about the case. Many highlighted the complexities surrounding tattoos, identity, and rehabilitation, calling for more comprehensive approaches that look beyond appearances. The ruling became a focal point for debates on how the justice system should approach young offenders with visible markers of their past. Within the prison system, Marcus's case was cited as an example of the challenges faced by youth seeking parole, while visibly marked by their histories. Correctional officers and counselors noted the difficulty of balancing security concerns with support for rehabilitation, especially when tattoos served as persistent reminders of gang ties. For Marcus's family, the ruling was a devastating blow. They grappled with the reality that his path to freedom was now more uncertain, complicated by the very symbols he wore as part of his identity. Their support remained steadfast, even as they faced the emotional toll of the court's decision. The parole board's refusal to grant Marcus Rivera's release underscored the powerful role that tattoos played in shaping legal outcomes. What began as ink on skin had transformed into a decisive factor, influencing perceptions of risk, remorse, and readiness for reintegration. The courtroom had witnessed more than a legal hearing. It had witnessed the collision of identity, justice, and societal expectations. As Marcus was led back to his cell, the courtroom emptied with a mixture of reflection and unresolved questions. The decision was final for now, but the larger conversation about tattoos, youth, and justice was far from over. The echoes of this ruling would continue to influence debates on rehabilitation, stigma, and the path forward for countless young offenders navigating the complex intersection of personal history and public safety. The denial of Marcus Rivera's parole sent ripples far beyond the courtroom walls, ushering in a new chapter of profound consequences and personal reckoning. As he was escorted back to his cell, the weight of the judge's ruling settled heavily on his shoulders, marking not just a legal setback, but a turning point in a life already burdened by hardship and defiance. Inside the stark confines of the juvenile detention center, Marcus faced the immediate reality of extended incarceration. The denial meant more time behind bars, more distance from the outside world, and a renewed challenge to find meaning and growth within the rigid structures of confinement. The visible tattoos that had played such a pivotal role in his hearing now seemed to cage him as much as the physical walls surrounding him. Among fellow inmates, Marcus's tattoos were a double-edged sword. They commanded respect in some circles, signaling a reputation and history that few dared challenge. Yet, they also marked him as a subject of scrutiny by correctional officers and rehabilitation staff, who viewed the inked symbols as indicators of ongoing gang ties and potential risk. This dual perception complicated his efforts to engage meaningfully with programs designed to foster change. The psychological impact of the parole denial weighed heavily on Marcus. Interviews with prison counselors revealed a young man grappling with frustration and a sense of stagnation. The tattoos, once a source of identity and strength, had become a barrier to his progress, a constant reminder of the court's doubts about his readiness for freedom. Yet, beneath the surface, Marcus wrestled with a growing awareness of the consequences of his choices and the challenges ahead. His family, too, bore the emotional toll of the decision. Visits became bittersweet occasions, filled with both hope and heartbreak. Marcus's mother spoke candidly about the strain of watching her son's path darken, the struggle to support him while confronting the societal barriers that his tattoos represented. "It's like the world sees those marks before they see my boy," she lamented, a sentiment echoed by other family members caught in the web of stigma and legal judgment. The extended incarceration also affected Marcus's relationships outside the facility. Friends and community ties frayed under the pressure of absence and changing circumstances. The tattoos, once symbols of connection, now seemed to isolate him further, creating a divide between his identity inside and the life waiting beyond the prison gates. Within the juvenile justice system, Marcus's case became emblematic of a broader challenge: managing young offenders whose visible tattoos complicate perceptions of rehabilitation. Correctional staff faced the delicate task of balancing security concerns with efforts to support personal growth. Programs aimed at education, vocational training, and counseling were offered. But the persistence of tattoo-related stigmas often hindered full engagement. Marcus's response to these challenges was complex. At times, he exhibited defiance and resistance, behaviors interpreted by some staff as signs of recalcitrance. Yet, there were also moments of introspection and participation, suggesting a young man caught between asserting his identity and seeking a path toward change. The tattoos, inseparable from his story, continued to shape these dynamics. The parole board's decision reverberated through the justice system, prompting discussions among policymakers, legal experts, and advocates about the role of tattoos in assessing risk and readiness for release. Some called for reforms that would separate visible markers from judgments of character, emphasizing individualized evaluations over assumptions based on appearance. Others cautioned that community safety must remain paramount, especially in cases tied to gang-related violence. Marcus's case also fueled ongoing debates about juvenile justice and the treatment of young offenders. His tattoos had become a symbol of the tension between punishment and rehabilitation, between societal fears and the potential for growth. The denial of parole underscored the difficulties of navigating these competing priorities within a system grappling with complex social realities. Amid these broader discussions, Marcus himself remained at the center of a personal journey marked by uncertainty and struggle. The denial forced a reckoning with the consequences of his past and the visible symbols that had become both his armor and his chains. As days turned into months, he faced the daunting task of redefining himself within a system that viewed his tattoos as evidence of defiance rather than transformation. Counselors and mentors working with Marcus sought to support this process, encouraging him to explore new forms of identity beyond the ink on his skin. They introduced creative outlets, education, and therapy aimed at fostering self-awareness and resilience. These efforts, while promising, contended with the persistent stigma and institutional barriers that tattoos imposed. The broader community also wrestled with the implications of Marcus's case. Advocates for criminal justice reform highlighted the need for more nuanced approaches that recognize the complexities of youth identity and the potential for rehabilitation. They argued that visible markers like tattoos should not predetermine an individual's fate, but rather be considered within a holistic understanding of growth and change. Conversely, victims' families and community leaders emphasized the importance of caution and accountability. For them, Marcus's tattoos were not just symbols, but reminders of real harm and ongoing risks. The denial of parole was seen as a necessary measure to honor their experiences and protect vulnerable populations. Within this contested landscape, Marcus's future remained uncertain. The tattoos that had once seemed to define him on the streets now defined him within the justice system, influencing perceptions, opportunities, and the possibility of freedom. His story became a poignant illustration of the challenges faced by young offenders navigating the complex intersection of identity, stigma, and the law. As Marcus continued his sentence, the echoes of the parole hearing lingered, reminders of a moment when personal expression collided with societal judgment, and when the ink on his skin became a powerful symbol shaping the trajectory of his life. The consequences of that day extended beyond the courtroom, touching every facet of his existence and raising profound questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the path forward for young people like him. Years have passed since the tense parole hearing that left Marcus Rivera confined within the prison walls. His tattoos a constant reminder of both his past and the obstacles to his future. Now a young man approaching his mid-20s, Marcus reflects on the winding and painful journey that has defined his life since that courtroom decision. The path has been fraught with struggle, self-discovery, and a relentless confrontation with the complex legacy of his choices and identity. Inside the correctional facility, Marcus has spent his formative years navigating the difficult terrain of incarceration, grappling with the weight of his visible tattoos and the stigma they carry. These markings, once sources of pride and belonging, evolved into symbols that shaped how he was perceived by guards, counselors, and fellow inmates alike. His tattoos, etched in defiance during his adolescent years, became both armor and barrier, signaling allegiance to some, suspicion to others. During this time, Marcus has engaged in various rehabilitative programs. Some mandated, others sought out in moments of genuine introspection. Educational classes, vocational training, and therapeutic sessions have offered glimpses of possibility, opportunities to envision a life beyond the ink and the prison walls. Yet, the shadow of his past and the visible evidence of it have remained persistent hurdles in his quest for redemption. The legal system that once denied him parole, based much on the symbolism of his tattoos, has continued to grapple with the broader implications of his case. Marcus's story became a reference point in discussions about juvenile justice reform, the treatment of young offenders, and the role of personal expression in the evaluation of risk and rehabilitation. His case highlighted the tensions between accountability and compassion, between societal safety and the potential for change. In response to cases like Marcus's, some jurisdictions introduced legislative reforms aimed at creating a more nuanced approach to juvenile sentencing and parole. The so-called Rivera Act, named in recognition of the national attention his case garnered, sought to balance the need for public safety with the developmental realities of youth offenders. It allowed for blended sentences that combined incarceration with structured rehabilitation and opportunities for earlier parole based on demonstrated growth, rather than external markers alone. Marcus's family, though fractured by years of hardship, remained a source of support and hope. His mother, in particular, became an advocate for youth caught in similar cycles of violence and incarceration, She helped establish a foundation focused on conflict resolution and mentorship programs for at-risk youth, seeking to prevent others from following the path that led Marcus to prison. Their relationship, tested but enduring, underscored the complex interplay of love, loss, and resilience. Inside prison, Marcus's reflections grew deeper. He grappled with questions of identity, responsibility, and the meaning of freedom. The tattoos that once defined him as a member of a gang and a participant in a dangerous lifestyle took on new significance. Symbols of a past he could not erase, but hoped to transcend. His journey became one of transformation, seeking to rewrite the narrative inscribed on his skin and in his life. The years have also brought moments of reckoning with the consequences of his actions. Marcus confronted the pain he caused victims and their families, participating in restorative justice programs when possible. These encounters, difficult and humbling, contributed to his evolving understanding of accountability and the complexities of forgiveness. Despite the challenges, Marcus has shown glimpses of maturity and self-awareness that hint at the possibility of true rehabilitation. Counselors note his growing ability to reflect on his past choices and to envision a future that breaks from the patterns of his youth. Yet, the path remains uncertain, constrained by the lingering stigma attached to his tattoos and the systemic barriers that often accompany such visible markers. The broader societal conversation sparked by Marcus's case continues to evolve. Debates about the role of tattoos in the justice system, the balance between appearance and character, and the treatment of juvenile offenders remain vibrant and unresolved. His story serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities involved in judging young lives shaped by environment, identity, and the scars they bear. As Marcus approaches a new phase in his life, he carries with him the lessons, regrets, and hopes forged through years of confinement and reflection. The tattoos, once symbols of defiance, now coexist with a growing desire for redemption and change. His journey embodies the ongoing struggle to reconcile past mistakes with the human capacity for growth. The legacy of Marcus Rivera's case endures, not only in legal reforms or public debates, but in the quiet, personal transformation of a young man seeking to redefine himself beyond the ink and the courtroom. His story challenges society to look beyond surface appearances and to recognize the intricate, often painful paths toward healing and justice. In the years ahead, Marcus's life will continue to unfold, a testament to the complexities of juvenile justice and the enduring questions about identity, accountability, and redemption. The courtroom drama that once centered on his tattoos has become a chapter in a larger narrative about the possibilities and limits of change, the power of personal expression, and the quest for a second chance in a world quick to judge by appearances.